Free Japan Channel number 73. Today, April 14th, Monday. The week began. Monday morning. The time is 9 a.m. Spring morning has come here in Yokohama, Japan. Hi guys. How are you doing? Here, spring season and the climate, weather is very comfortable and the green is shining here in Japan. So spring is, of course, the best season for us to enjoy the scenery. Today's FGC topic is war, kamikaze attacks, so crazy. The story of war, Pacific War. In 1944, the Japanese force was defeated, so there was no military achievement on the side of Japan in 1944. Every battle was the losing. Every battle, Japanese force, Navy and Army were defeated by the US force. The Pacific War was waged by Japan and the United States. The national power, which means economic power as well as industrial power, were so different between two countries. There is no exact document about this national power at the time. Probably 10 times at least the United States was 10 times bigger than Japan in terms of industry, economy, and military force. This fact was known among high-ranking soldiers, high-ranking military officials, and government leaders, even at the beginning of war. Therefore, for Japanese military force, the only way to wage war against the United States was to defeat American force as thoroughly as possible and occupy Hawaii and attacks west coast of the mainland of the United States and induce American citizens to stop the war, to pressure the US government to stop the war. It was the only way to do for Japanese military force. Isoroku Yamamoto, the Supreme Admiral in Japanese Imperial Navy at the time, knew this fact very well. Therefore, he tried to end the war against the United States as soon as possible. Japanese Imperial Navy had to repeat the victorious result again and again. At first, Hawaii operation was successful. Malay Peninsula was also occupied by Japanese army. Even in the Indian Sea, Japanese fleet defeated UK fleet completely at that time. Japanese aircraft carriers had so many skillful and experienced pilots. And at the time, Japanese bomb divers, torpedo planes, and of course, combat plane Zero were so out of quality of art, state of art. Therefore, no other countries could catch up with Japanese military force in 1941, 1942. However, 1943, US began to turn out so many latest aircraft carriers, battleships, and of course planes. F-4F Wildcat, F-6F Hellcat were the best combat planes at the time. They outweigh zero in 1944, 1945. And so many high-tech aircraft carriers and big battleships were introduced in the Pacific region by the United States. Then, Japanese industrial power could not compete with it anymore. 1944, in the Battle of Leyte, Philippines, the first kamikaze attack was operated by Japanese naval force. There were skillful pilots at that time, and these pilots were on the cockpit, and they left airfield with planes, military planes, with bombs, suicide attacks. They could not come back from the battlefield. At first, the United States force were not ready for these suicide attacks. Therefore, they were so astonished at the movement of Japanese airplanes, which didn't avoid the fire from the ships. They only charged against US battleships or aircraft carriers. And these attacks of Kamikaze 1944 in October were militarily so successful. Therefore, even Japanese high-ranking soldiers, officials, were amazed at the feat of these pilots. Of course, it was much more difficult to drop the bomb and to come back than to charge into the ships without going back. In this sense, kamikaze attacks were, in a sense, easy attacks because pilots didn't expect to come back. They could only concentrate on charging into the ships, US ships. But the weak point of kamikaze attacks is that these pilots were never back alive again. Skillful pilots were in operation and never appear afterwards. In the normal military operation, skillful soldiers or pilots or sailors could work as long as they are alive. So they could employ their expertise, military expertise, and they could also hand on their knowledge and experience, skills to following generation. However, in conducting kamikaze attacks, Japanese force began to run out of the skills and experience accumulated by good previous generation. Japanese force had no choice but to continue this kamikaze attack because the result was so salient among Japanese military officials. They thought that kamikaze attacks were the only way to save their country in 1944 and 1945. Kamikaze attacks were mainly conducted in 1945, so the last year of the Pacific War. Battle in Okinawa. Then, from the airfield of Kyushu, so many young pilots, sometimes experienced, other times inexperienced, left the airfield and they attacked the US fleet, which were gathering around the Okinawa waters. However, already at this time of the year 1945 spring, US Navy, US fleet were already prepared for kamikaze attacks, and they could effectively protect themselves by devising the protection method against kamikaze pilots. In addition, the combat planes of the United States were so outweighing at that time. The kamikaze planes with bombs of 250 kilograms were not agile enough to avoid the US combat planes F-4F and F-6F, mainly F-6F in 1945. Kamikaze planes could not even reach the US fleet. Before that, they were crushed by American planes. And today's theme were these kamikaze attacks so crazy. The success rate of kamikaze attacks were approximately 15%. Look, do you think this figure high and low? The success rate was 15%. At that time, Japanese Army and Japanese Navy could do nothing to cause serious damage to the US fleet or US Army. However, only kamikaze attacks could break this vicious cycle, and Japanese military officials realized that even low success rate, 15%, is much better than nothing. Of course it was. It was better than nothing. Therefore, they resorted to this suicide attack. The best way for Japanese people to adopt at the time was to end the war as soon as possible, because the war against the United States could not be won. It was clear. It was clear for everybody. But Japanese refused to end the war. They continued, knowing that this war could not be won on the side of Japan. So this stupidity and obstinacy on the side of Japan was the real cause of the tragedy in Pacific War, in my opinion. Stupidity and obstinacy on the side of Japanese people. Today, 2025, therefore, 80 years have passed since the end of war. 80 years. Japanese people haven't reflected on the war systematically. Therefore, even in today's Japanese society, the same mistakes, same blunders which Japanese force, Navy, Imperial Navy and Army did is now being repeated everywhere in the social corners. Today, this year, the 80th anniversary, not anniversary, but 80 years have passed since the end of war. It's not too late. So for Japanese people, it is already the time to mull over the essence of blunders in the Pacific War. In this channel, FGC, during the summer, I will broadcast the details of Pacific War and offer dear listeners some clues to look back on the war that Japanese people fought 80 or 90 years ago. Thank you.